My mom called it a fresh start. I called it a 300 square foot apartment with water stains on the ceiling and a roommate listing that said, and I'm quoting directly here, clean, quiet, not interested in becoming friends. That was the whole bio. No name, no photo, just those 10 words and a monthly rent figure that was the only reason I didn't immediately scroll past it. His name was Callum Reese. I only found that out when I knocked on the already open door on move-in day and he walked out of the kitchen holding a mug of black coffee, looked at the 2 boxes I was carrying, looked at my face and then said, "There's only one parking spot, it's mine, I assume you don't have a car." "I don't," I said. He nodded like that was the only acceptable answer and went back into the kitchen. I stood in the doorway for probably 8 full seconds before I realized he was done talking. That was November, and I'd like to say I immediately knew something would happen between us, that there was this electric undercurrent from the very first moment, but honestly, I mostly just thought he was kind of a jerk, not a cruel jerk, not threatening, just someone who had arranged his entire personality around making it clear he did not need you, did not want you nearby, and would not apologize for either of those things. He worked from home doing something with financial modeling. I only knew that because of the triple monitor setup in his bedroom that I accidentally saw when his door swung open one afternoon. He kept the common areas immaculate. He cooked at exactly the same time every day, 7:15 in the morning and 6:30 at night, meals that smelled genuinely incredible and that he never once offered to share. He was in bed by 10. He did not watch TV with the volume on. He owned maybe 4 pieces of furniture and approximately 11 books, all stacked in a very specific order I accidentally disrupted once while dusting, which led to the most words he'd said to me in a single conversation up to that point. "Did you move these?" "I was just cleaning." "They were in orders." "I put them back." "Not in the same order." I looked at the stack, they all looked the same to me. "I'm sorry, what was the order?" He didn't answer. He just picked them up one by one and reorganized them, and I stood there like an idiot because I genuinely didn't know whether to leave or stay, and my body had somehow chosen a third option, which was to just remain completely still while he did it. When he finished, he said, "Thank you for cleaning," and went back to his room. I told my best friend Marcus about this on the phone that night, and he laughed for about 45 seconds straight and then said, "Okay, but is he cute?" And I said, "That is completely not the point, Marcus." And Marcus said, "Is he cute though?" And I said, "He has really good bone structure," and then Marcus laughed for another full minute and I hung up on him. The thing about Callum is that his coldness wasn't mean. That's the part that was confusing. He wasn't trying to make me feel bad. He wasn't dismissive in a way that felt like he was doing it on purpose. It was more like he'd simply removed social performance from his life the way other people remove sugar from their diet, deliberately, thoroughly, with no apparent regret. He'd say thank you when I held the door. He'd let me know if he was going to be out so I could use the kitchen. Once, when I left my umbrella in the hallway, he moved it inside and leaned it against my door so I'd see it. He just didn't do small talk, he didn't ask how my day was, he didn't linger. And in those early weeks I told myself that was fine, actually great. I was busy with my new job at the graphic design firm 3 blocks away. I didn't need a friend in my living space. This was professional, this was an adult, this was fine. But here's the thing about sharing 300 square feet with someone. You notice things, you can't help it. I noticed that he drank his coffee in the same chair every morning facing the window, and that for about 20 minutes he just sat there not looking at his phone, not reading, just sitting. I noticed that when he cooked he moved like someone who'd been doing it for a very long time, economical, no wasted motion, but not tense about it either. I noticed that he had a scar on the inside of his left wrist that he never explained and that I never asked about. I noticed that sometimes, late at night, he would sit on the fire escape. I could see the glow of a small lamp through the gap in the curtains and stay there for an hour, sometimes more. I noticed these things and filed them away without meaning to, and every time I filed one I told myself I was just being observant, just a side effect of being a graphic designer. I was trained to look at things. But I knew that wasn't really it. It was the 3rd week of December when things shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that would look significant from the outside. It was a Tuesday night and I'd had a genuinely terrible day, the kind where nothing goes catastrophically wrong, everything just goes slightly wrong in a way that accumulates into something heavy. My manager had rejected a project I'd spent 2 weeks on. I'd gotten a bill I wasn't expecting. My mom called to ask if I was making friends in the new city in a tone that suggested she was worried. The answer was no. She wasn't wrong. I got home at 7 something and Callum was in the kitchen finishing his dinner, which he did sometimes at the counter when he was eating quickly, And I came through the door and put my bag down, and I must have looked pretty bad because he stopped mid-bite and looked at me. Not a long look, just a beat, and then he looked back at his plate. I went to the cabinet to get a glass of water, and I realized my hands were shaking a little, the way they do when you've been holding something together all day and then you finally get somewhere you can let it go. I turned on the tap and just stood there for a second. Behind me, I heard him get up. I heard him open the fridge. Then he set something down on the counter next to me, a container of leftover pasta he'd apparently made earlier in the week and a fork, and then he just went back to the counter and kept eating his own food. He didn't say anything, he didn't explain it, he just put food next to me and kept going. I stood there looking at the container, then I looked at him, he didn't look up. I sat down at the small kitchen table and ate the pasta, which was genuinely very good, some kind of olive oil and lemon situation with herbs I didn't know the name of, and we sat in the kitchen together not talking, and it was the least lonely I'd felt since moving to the city. After a few minutes he got up, rinsed his plate and said "night" and went to his room. I said thank you, and I meant it in a way that was probably too much for a container of pasta. And he either didn't notice or chose not to respond to the weight of it. That night I lay in bed and thought about the way he'd done it, how he hadn't asked if I was okay, hadn't said something comforting, hadn't made it weird, he just addressed it in the only way he apparently knew how to address things, practically quietly without demanding anything from me in return. I was in so much trouble. I didn't do anything about it, I want to be clear about that. I'm not the kind of person who acts on things quickly. I'm the kind of person who notices something, thinks about it for 3 to 5 business days, convinces himself it's nothing, continues thinking about it, and eventually arrives at some form of honesty when the option to avoid it has completely run out. So I kept living there, I kept being a good roommate. I did my dishes, I kept my noise down, I didn't touch his books again. We developed these small routines that felt almost like a language. He'd make extra coffee without saying anything and leave the pot on, and I started leaving the window in the living room cracked at night because I noticed he seemed to sleep better when there was a little air. I don't know how I noticed that, I just did. Christmas came and went. He didn't go anywhere for the holiday. I went home to my mom's for 3 days and came back to find the apartment exactly as I'd left it and Callum sitting in his chair with his coffee like no time had passed. "How was it?" he said. I was so startled that he'd asked that it took me a second to answer. "Good, loud," my Aunt Helen was there. He made a sound that might have been sympathy. "Do you have a family?" I asked, and then immediately regretted it because that felt like a too much of a question, the kind of question he might shut down with silence. But he just said, "A brother, in Dublin, we don't really talk much." And I nodded and didn't push it, and he seemed to appreciate that, and something in the room shifted about 3 degrees in a direction I couldn't quite name. January was cold and relentless, and Callum got sick. I don't mean dramatically sick. I mean the regular kind, a bad cold that started on a Wednesday and just sat there, making him look exhausted and slightly grayish and not quite like himself. I only knew he was sick because I came out for water at 2 in the morning and found him sitting on the couch with a blanket and a box of tissues, which was so unlike him that I stopped in the doorway and said, "Are you okay?" "Fine," he said, in a voice that was clearly not fine, rough and low and congested. "Do you need anything? I have some." "I'm fine." He clearly wasn't. And normally, actually, I don't know what I would have done normally. In the first few weeks, I definitely would have let it go. But this was now, and now was different, and I went to the bathroom and got the cold medicine and the throat spray and brought them back without asking and set them on the coffee table. He looked at them, then at me. "I'll heat up some water for tea," I said, "or I have soup, canned so it's not like what you make but." A beat, his voice when he spoke was quieter than usual or maybe just more tired. "Tea is fine." I made the tea. I brought it back and sat down in the armchair across from him, not right next to him, giving him space, and he drank the tea and we watched some nature documentary he'd apparently had on quietly in the background, neither of us speaking. After maybe 20 minutes he said, "You don't have to stay up." "I know." He didn't say anything else. I didn't leave. We watched a segment about walruses and eventually he fell asleep on the couch, sitting up, the blanket pulled half over him, and I very quietly got up and pulled it up properly and turned the TV off and went back to my room. I barely slept. Not because of anything big. Just because I lay there thinking about the fact that at some point in the last 2 months, this person who had made a whole point of not needing anyone had drunk tea I made him without arguing, and had fallen asleep in the same room as me, and that felt enormous in a way I couldn't fully articulate. He was better by the weekend, not completely but mostly, back to his routine and his coffee and his quiet mornings. But something between us was different now in a way that felt real rather than imagined. He started saying good morning when we passed each other in the kitchen, which sounds small but was not small, not from him. Once, on a Saturday, he asked what I was working on. I'd spread a project out on the living room table, and when I showed him the color studies I was doing, he looked at them for a long moment and said, "This one," pointing at one I'd been unsure about, and walked away. It was the right one. I used it, the client loved it. Marcus called that week and asked how the roommate situation was going, and I said, "Good," and Marcus said, "That's a very weird face you're making for someone who just said good." "I'm on the phone, you can't see my face. I've known you for 11 years, I can hear your face." I didn't tell him about the tea or the pasta or the books or any of it. I said it's fine, he's just a private person, and changed the subject, and Marcus let me because Marcus understands when I'm not ready to say something out loud yet. I wasn't ready. The thing is, when you like someone who's built like a closed door, you spend a lot of time trying to figure out which parts of what they do are just how they are and which parts might mean something. Every small thing becomes a question. When he left a book on the table, one of his books moved from its very specific stack. Had he put it there for me to see? When he started timing his fire escape evenings so they overlapped with the time I usually came home, was that on purpose? When he laughed, quiet and sudden, at something I'd said as I walked by, a throwaway comment I hadn't even meant as a joke, and then looked quickly back at whatever he was reading like he hadn't done it, what did that mean? I am aware that what does it mean when someone laughs at my joke is not a mystery requiring serious analysis. But when the person doing it is Callum Reese, somehow it is. February came in cold and then went suddenly warm for a few days in the middle, that weird false spring that makes you trust the world prematurely. One of those warm evenings I came home to find Callum on the fire escape, which wasn't unusual, but the door was open wider than he normally left it, which was unusual. I put my stuff down, I made myself something to eat, about my evening, and then at some point I walked past the open door and he said, "There's room." 2 words said to the city skyline, not to me, but I was the only other person there. I got my jacket and went out and sat down across from him. The fire escape was narrow enough that our knees were fairly close. He had his small lamp out there, the one I'd noticed from inside, and a notebook he apparently used to write things in sometimes, and he closed it when I sat down. We sat there for probably an hour. We talked more that night than we had in the entire 3 months we'd been living together. Not about anything life-changing at first. He asked about the firm I worked at, what kind of projects I liked, whether I'd always been interested in design. And I answered, and I asked him about the financial modeling, and he explained it in a way that was genuinely interesting. Not because finance is inherently interesting to me, but because the way he talked about patterns in numbers was actually how I thought about patterns in visual space, and I said that and he went quiet for a second and then said, yeah. At some point I said, "Can I ask you something?" He looked at me. "Why did you put in that roommate listing that you weren't interested in being friends, like specifically that?" He was quiet for a moment looking at the city, then he said, "Previous experience. With roommates. With people." He said it flatly, no self-pity in it, just a fact. I didn't push, but after another minute he said, "I tend to be easier to be around than to actually know. People decide they want to know me and then they don't really. It's easier if expectations are set up front." I thought about that. What if someone actually did want to know you? He looked at me then directly and something passed over his face that I couldn't read, and then he looked away and said, "You're cold, you should probably go in." I wasn't cold, he knew I wasn't cold. I went inside anyway because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is give someone a graceful exit. But I thought about what he said for a long time after, the specific phrasing of it, easier to be around than to actually know. Like he'd done the work of understanding his own effect on people and just decided to preemptively protect them from getting closer than they'd ultimately want. I wanted to tell him he'd calculated wrong, at least in my case. But I also knew that telling him that would require explaining why, and I wasn't sure I was ready to be that honest yet, or that it would land well, or that I hadn't completely misread everything. So I said nothing, and we went back to our routines. It was a Friday in late February when things cracked open, and it happened because of something genuinely stupid and minor, which is how it usually goes. I did people from work over, just two colleagues, Priya and Damien, for a few hours after work, and I'd told Callum in advance and he'd nodded and disappeared into his room, which was fine, which was the arrangement. But around 9 they were still there and getting louder, not wildly loud but loud, and I went to knock on Callum's door just to check in, and he opened it looking pale and tired in a way I hadn't seen since the cold in January. "Are you okay?" "I have a migraine," he said, low voice tight around the edges. "Oh God, I'm so sorry, I'll get them out." "You don't need to." "Callum, I'll get them out." I went back out and made our apologies. Priya and Damien were genuinely understanding, honestly they were great about it, and got them out the door. I went back to the kitchen and got a glass of water and some ibuprofen and knocked on Callum's door again. He opened it. He'd taken his glasses off. I'd sometimes seen him in glasses when he'd been working late and hadn't realized I was around, and without them he looked different. More open, somehow, more tired. He looked at the water and the ibuprofen. He took them. "Do you need a dark room or?" "I'm fine." "You're really not? Do you want the curtains in the living room closed? Sometimes when I get migraines the ambient light helps more than." "You get migraines?" "Sometimes the dark room and no sound thing helps me, but everyone's different." He was leaning slightly against the doorframe in a way that looked like he was using it more than he meant to. He said, "A dark room is good, sound is worse than light." "Okay, I'll close everything. Do you want to be in here or out there? It's stuffy here." So Callum came out and lay on the couch with a pillow over his face, and I closed the curtains and turned off every light, and I sat down in the armchair in the dark, and I just sat there, quietly, not doing anything particularly helpful, just being there in the room, being another person in the room. After about 10 minutes his voice came from under the pillow. "You don't have to stay." "I know," I said for the second time. Another long silence. Then, "This is weird." "Is it?" "Sitting in the dark not talking." "We don't have to talk." "I know that's." He shifted, took the pillow off his face. In the dark I could just barely see the outline of him facing the ceiling. "That's not what I meant." I waited. He said, "I don't know how to do this." I wasn't sure what he meant. I asked, "Do what?" "This." A pause. "You, whatever this is." My heart was doing something terrible. I kept my voice calm. "It's just two people in an apartment." "No, it's not," he said, and he said it simply, without accusation or anything loaded, just a correction of a fact. "It hasn't been that for a while." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I had words available at that moment. "I put that in the listing," he said, "because I meant it at the time." Another pause. "I didn't expect you." "What did you expect?" "Someone interchangeable, someone I could just exist alongside." "You got that," I said, and there was something in my voice I hadn't meant to put there. "I didn't," he said, "not even close." The dark room held us for a moment. I could hear the city outside muffled behind the curtains, and then I heard him shift again, and I heard him say very quietly, "Is this, do you, are you?" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at this." "I know," I said, and then, because I'd been carrying it since November and I was genuinely tired of not saying it, "I like you, if that's what you're trying to ask." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that was terrifying to say. "Yeah. I like you," he said, like he was testing the words. "I've been trying not to for a while." "How's that going?" "Poorly." A pause. "Obviously." I laughed, quiet, more exhaled than laughing. He made a sound that might have been his version of the same thing. "Your head," I said. "It's a little better." "Still." "Still," he agreed, and we both let that sit there. We stayed in the dark room for another couple of hours, not talking much. Occasionally saying something small. I mentioned a project, he asked a question, we let long silences exist between things. And it was easy. That's the thing I want to say about it. It was just easy in a way that nothing between us had been before, or maybe it was easy the same way all of it had been easy once I'd stopped expecting him to be something different. I went to bed eventually because he was starting to actually fall asleep on the couch and I didn't want to wake him. I got up quietly and got him another blanket from the closet, one of the heavier ones, and I put it over him and started to move away. His hand caught my wrist. Not gripping, just resting there like a question. I stayed still. He was half asleep, eyes barely open, and he said, "Don't go yet." And so I sat down on the floor next to the couch back against it and I stayed there in the dark for a while longer. After a few minutes his hand moved from my wrist to my hair just briefly, just a touch, and then it dropped back. I stayed until I was sure he was actually asleep. Then I went to my room and lay down in the dark and thought, okay, this is what's happening. I wasn't scared exactly, it wasn't a giddy feeling either. It was something more like the particular relief of a thing you'd been bracing for that turns out to be fine actually, turns out to be good. Saturday morning, I woke up uncertain how any of it would feel in daylight, which is always the question, isn't it? Does it evaporate? Does the person you were in the dark become someone more contained, more defended? I got up and he was already in his chair with his coffee, already up, looking out the window. I went to make my own coffee and he said, without looking up, "How do you take it?" I told him, he got up and made it for me. He handed me the mug and there was a moment where we were both holding it, his fingers near mine, and he didn't immediately let go. He looked at me, daytime him, fully awake and guarded and precise about everything. He let go of the mug. He sat back down. He said, "I don't know how to not be how I am." "I know," I said. "That's not a small thing. I know that too." He looked at his coffee, then at me. "I'm not going to suddenly be different. I'm not asking you to be. You say that now." "Callum," I sat down across from him. "I've been here for 3 months, I know who you are, I like who you are, I'm not waiting for a different version." He looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd said the wrong thing. And then he put down his coffee and leaned forward slightly, toward me, and I leaned forward slightly too because it felt like the obvious response to that, like gravity, and he kissed me. Quiet, brief. His hand came up just barely to the side of my jaw, just his fingertips, and then he pulled back and sat there and looked at me, and his expression was the least guarded I had ever seen it, somewhere between certain and terrified. "Okay," I said, because I had nothing else. "Okay," he said. We didn't talk about it obsessively after. That's not who either of us was, I think. We didn't have a big conversation where we defined everything and gave it a name. It moved slowly, the way everything between us had moved slowly, the way I think it needed to. He started sitting with me in the mornings instead of alone with the window. Not every morning, but some mornings, he'd make the coffee and I'd come out and we'd just sit there together with the quiet and the light. He told me about his brother in Dublin, about why they didn't talk. It was complicated in a way I didn't press, just listened, and he seemed relieved to have been listened to rather than analyzed. I showed him my sketchbooks, the old ones from before I had any idea what I was doing, the embarrassing early ones. He looked at every page with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and he said, "You had it then too, the eye for it, you just didn't trust it yet." I thought about that for days. We were on the fire escape one night in early March, properly warm now, real spring this time, and I said, "Can I ask what made you put the lamp out here?" Because I'd always wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment. After my last place, I lived alone for 2 years. I started feeling like the apartment was too sealed, like there was no air getting in. The lamp was a way of being outside without being fully outside. That makes sense. Most things I do make sense to me. I know I like that about you. He looked sideways at me, that my behavior makes sense to me. That you know yourself, a lot of people don't, they're just kind of reacting to everything, you actually know what you need. He was quiet, then I didn't know I needed this. The lamp was small between us. The city was doing what cities do at night, loud and indifferent and somehow comforting in its vastness. "Me either," I said. He reached over and took my hand, the way he did sometimes now, simple and unpracticed, like he was still learning the gesture and choosing to do it anyway. And we sat there on the fire escape in the first real warmth of the year, and I thought about the listing that had said not interested in becoming friends, and how a person's stated intentions and their actual needs can be so completely different without them even knowing it, and how sometimes the best things in your life are things you were carefully, specifically, not looking for. 3 weeks later, Marcus finally met him. We'd all gone out for dinner, my idea, soft pressure over several days, and afterward, walking back to the subway, Marcus fell into step beside me while Callum was slightly ahead checking his phone. Okay, Marcus said quietly. What? I get it. Get what? Why couldn't you explain it? He glanced at Callum's back. He's not what you'd expect, there's a lot going on in there. Yeah. He looked at you twice during dinner when you were telling the story about the file corrupting, like he was genuinely amused. Like you delighted him and he was annoyed that you delighted him. That sounds about right. Marcus laughed. God, you two are going to be incredibly annoying to spend time with. Thanks. That's a compliment. Good couples are always a little annoying. He shook his head. Okay, I approve, not that you asked. Callum looked back at us then like he'd sensed he was being discussed and met my eyes for just a moment, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did sometimes, not quite a smile, something more private than that, something that was only for me and probably for no one else in his life. I thought about that listing again, clean, quiet, not interested in becoming friends. And I thought, well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd seen a different listing that day, if someone else had needed the room. I think about how close to not happening the whole thing was, and it gives me this strange feeling in my chest that isn't quite fear and isn't quite gratitude, but is probably the intersection of both. The particular anxiety of understanding how many small accidents stood between you and a life that would have been missing something you now can't imagine being without. He still keeps his books in order. I still don't touch them. He still has the fire escape evenings, and now I'm often there, and on the nights I'm not, he still leaves the door open a little wider than he needs to. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The door is a little more open than necessary. The extra coffee was left in the pot. The pasta on the counter. All the ways he said things he didn't have the words for yet in the language he had, which was small acts and exact attention and showing up quietly in the moments that mattered. I don't know if I believe in fate or any of that, but I do believe that some people come into your life and make you more sure of yourself by how completely they see you. And I believe that being seen by someone who has actively decided not to look at most people, that means something. That means a lot, actually. He's in the other room right now, the lamp on, probably the notebook. In a minute I'll knock on his door and he'll say come in without looking up, and I'll sit in the chair next to the desk and he'll eventually close the notebook and we'll just be in the same room, which is still somehow enough. Which is still somehow everything.